when eyes are on the lead.
I'm just very lucky to be in this moment.
Caitlin Clark will lead. A WNBA record 19 assists.
At this point, continue to be myself.
One game changed everything. Caitlin Clark didn't just lead the Indiana Fever to a dramatic victory. She shattered records the WNBA had never seen before. Playing through a back injury and a minutes restriction, Caitlin Clark did not miss a step after being sidelined for 5 games with a quad injury. Are you serious? Caitlin Clark. She delivered a performance that left fans and analysts in disbelief. But while Clark made history on the court, another story was unfolding behind the scenes. Questions about the Fever's injury reports, communication failures, and how the organization treats its biggest superstar kept growing louder. In today's video, we're breaking down Clark's unforgettable night, the record she destroyed, and the controversy that followed, the night Caitlin Clark made history. The Indiana Fever walked into their meeting with the Seattle Storm, carrying more urgency than the standings suggested. 2 nights earlier, Indiana had suffered a disappointing home loss to the Golden State Valkyries, the kind of result that tends to follow a team into its next matchup whether anyone wants it to or not. Seattle, meanwhile, entered the night with the league's worst record. A team that on paper should not have pushed a contender to the brink. Instead, the Fever found themselves trailing in the 4th quarter. Fever bring in the highest scoring offense in the WNBA, but were held in check on Wednesday. That's their season-low 75 points. And it was Caitlin Clark who refused to let the game slip away. Why does a matchup against the league's lowest-ranked team so often turn into the hardest night of the season? Basketball rarely follows the script written for it, and this one certainly did not. The defining sequence of the night was not even an offensive one. With the score tied and under a minute remaining, Clark tracked down a driving opponent and blocked the layup attempt clean at the rim, snuffing out what could have been the possession that decided the game in Seattle's favor. It was a reminder that the night's history was not built on scoring alone. It was built on a player refusing to concede a single possession on either end of the floor for the entire 4th quarter. Clark's final line read like a stat sheet built for a highlight reel that had not been invented yet. 45 points, 10 assists, 6 3-pointers on 10 attempts, 4 steals, 2 blocked shots, 11 made field goals on 18 attempts, 17 made free throws on 19 attempts. All of it delivered in 29 minutes while she remained on a minutes restriction as she continued recovering from a back injury that had shadowed her for weeks. Caitlin Clark before she was hurt during that game last night with the Phoenix Mercury. The team later confirmed that it's a back injury, so she left the game and didn't come back in. No player in the history of the Women's National Basketball Association had ever finished a single game with at least 40 points and at least 10 assists. Clark became the first. What does it say about a player when the record book runs out of comparisons for her night? The moment that sealed the win arrived with under a minute remaining, the score tied when Clark rose from beyond the arc and buried a 3-pointer that put Indiana ahead for good. The Fever closed out a 110-107 win that felt by the end inevitable. Even though for most of the 4th quarter, it had felt like anything but. Along the way, Clark also became the fastest player in league history to reach 200 career 3-pointers, doing it in just 74 games. And she broke the Fever's single-game scoring record, a mark of 38 points that had belonged to teammate Kelsey Mitchell. The game was carried on national television, which meant the record did not simply exist inside a box score buried in a late recap. It played out live in real time in front of an audience already primed to watch Clark's every possession. Would the moment have carried the same weight if it had unfolded on a quiet regional broadcast, watched by a fraction of the eyes that actually saw it happen? Timing in sports as much as anywhere else shapes how loudly a story gets told. And this one landed on the largest possible stage. The reaction outside the arena arrived almost as fast as the shots fell. The league's own accounts leaned into the moment, and figures across basketball media flagged the performance as something rarer than a career night. Caitlin, she continues to make history. She's the first rookie to win WNBA Player of the Month since the award's inception. A genuine first in a league with decades of statistical history behind it. That kind of instant near-universal recognition rarely happens by accident. It happens when a player produces something that forces everyone watching, whether they follow the sport closely or not, to stop and take notice. How many nights end with a shot that dramatic, and still get treated by the player who made it as unfinished business? None of these numbers happened in isolation either. Every one of them arrived under a spotlight that had followed Clark all season. cameras that treated nearly every possession as a referendum. Commentary that measured her against a level of scrutiny few players faced this early in a career. And still, when the clock ran out, the record book had a new category with a single name attached to it. History, in other words, did not ask anyone's permission. Why the record didn't matter to Clark. Within minutes of walking off the floor, Clark stood in front of a camera and did something her own record-setting numbers seemed designed to resist. She waved it off. Asked what the new franchise mark meant to her. She offered 6 words that said more about her mindset than any highlight could. It's cool. I don't really care. She followed it by explaining that her focus sat somewhere else entirely on helping her team reach a level she did not believe it had reached yet, regardless of what any single box score claimed about her. She also used the same interview to describe her team's defense that night as embarrassing. Despite the win, a comment that revealed as much about her standards as the 45 points did about her ceiling. Is it possible to call a historic individual performance secondary and actually mean it? For Clark, the answer seemed to be yes. And it was not the first time this season she had drawn that same line between personal accolades and collective results. Earlier in the year, she had strung together a run of 10 assist games. Be 6 of 10 shooting from deep. Help her reach 200 trays in 74 games. That's the fastest ever in league history. At a pace that outproduced the rest of the league combined, and even then she rarely lingered on the accomplishment for more than a sentence before redirecting the conversation back to winning. That refusal extended to the court itself. Despite playing under a minute's restriction while managing a back injury, Clark made clear afterward that no version of that night ended with her on the bench in the fourth quarter. She described telling her head coach at halftime that she felt good enough to finish the game regardless of the restriction because losing was not an outcome she was willing to accept from the sideline. The stubbornness read less like defiance and more like a player who understood exactly what the moment required and chose to supply it herself. Would a lesser competitor have taken the easy exit restriction or not with a career night already secured? That posture was not new either. Days before the record-setting game, Clark had already addressed the broader wave of criticism and attention that had followed her for weeks, telling reporters that some people would support her and some people would not, and that she had learned to treat both reactions as background noise rather than a distraction. She described needing thick skin to hold a position like hers, and made clear that the only opinions carrying any real weight belonged to the people inside her own locker room. That same detachment from outside noise showed up again in the way she processed a record that the rest of the sport treated as seismic. There is something almost contradictory about a performance this loud, paired with a reaction this quiet. A player capable of forcing the record book to make room for a category that never existed before. Standing at a podium minutes later, treating the achievement like a footnote. That contradiction, history on one side, indifference on the other, sets up a far more uncomfortable version of the same pattern once the lens shifts away from the player and toward the organization standing behind her. It is worth sitting with that contrast for a moment longer. A 24-year-old guard carrying a back injury and a minute's restriction. Wednesday, you might recall Clark didn't return to the game in that game against the Mercury from Phoenix because of a back injury, and that's something that she also dealt with last season. Produced a stat line that had eluded every player before her in the league's entire history. And her first instinct afterward was to talk about her team's defense. If the player at the center of the story treats the record as secondary, why would anyone expect the organization employing her to treat its own responsibilities as anything less than a priority? The communication breakdown. Long before the record-setting night in July, the Indiana Fever front office had already revealed something about its instincts. Not through what it said, but through what it failed to say in time. In May, the organization found itself at the center of a very different kind of story. One that had nothing to do with a box score and everything to do with communication. The league requires teams to designate a player's status by a set deadline the day before a game. The Fever missed that window entirely when it came to Clark. Clark had missed practice the day before to receive treatment. Yet, she was not listed on the injury report released that evening. The following day, with less than 2 hours remaining before tip-off, the organization announced she would be out with a back injury. Fans who had purchased tickets specifically to watch her play arrived at the arena or were already en route before learning she would not be on the floor. What does it mean for an organization to know something important and choose to sit on it until the deadline has already passed? Head coach Stephanie White addressed the confusion afterward, explaining that players sometimes go through a version of a scheduled rest day without appearing on the official report, and insisting Clark had been on the court in some capacity the day before. She denied that the absence reflected a pre-planned rest strategy, attributing the change instead to soreness. Clark said she woke up with that morning. The explanation answered the immediate question, but it did not answer the larger one. Why an organization managing the league's most closely watched player would let a communication gap like that happen in the first place. The pattern did not end there. In the weeks that followed, the same back injury forced Clark to miss another game entirely. Clark would ultimately leave the game in the third quarter, citing a back injury. It's unclear if either play directly contributed to her exit. Then limited her to a short rotation in which she managed only a handful of points and rebounds before sitting out the game after that as well. Each absence arrived with its own round of explanation, its own attempt to reassure a fan base that had already been burned once by a missed deadline. Was the Fever managing an injury or managing the fallout from how it had handled the first one? The fallout reached beyond a single night of frustrated fans. Coverage of the incident sparked a wider debate across basketball media about whether the league needed stricter enforcement around injury reporting altogether, given how much revenue and attendance now rides on a single player's availability. Commentators framed the missed deadline as more than an oversight, questioning whether an organization sitting on information that directly affected thousands of paying fans deserved the benefit of the doubt the next time a similar situation arose. Trust once treated carelessly tends to get measured far more skeptically the second time around. Does an organization get to ask for patience twice after burning through it once already? Fans who had traveled to the arena, some from well outside the city, were left airing their frustration publicly, describing an experience that felt less like an honest mistake and more like a franchise that had not prioritized its own ticket holders in the moment it mattered most. An organization can apologize for an oversight. It is much harder to apologize for a decision that looked from the outside like it had been made and then sat on. The incident in May did not involve controversy on the court, or a referee's whistle, or a rival player's foul. I want to talk to you about Caitlin Clark because she picked up her sixth technical foul of the season after complaining to a referee this following a no call on a very physical place. It involved something more basic. Whether an organization built around one of the most famous athletes in the sport could get a simple piece of paperwork right on time for the people who had shown up to watch her play. It would not be the last time that same organization found itself explaining after the fact why it had not said something sooner. The letter that changed everything. By early summer, the conversation surrounding Clark had already expanded well beyond box scores and injury reports. Late in June, during a game against the Phoenix Mercury, Clark absorbed a blow to the throat from an opposing player, an incident that immediately reignited a season-long debate over officiating and player protection across the league. Clark did not address the moment publicly right away. Nearly a week passed before she finally spoke, condemning what she described as harassment and hate directed at her team, and at opposing players alike, and making clear that none of it was acceptable. That silence from Clark herself lasted barely a week. The silence from her own organization, when a far larger version of the same story reached Washington, lasted longer. 11 members of Congress sent a letter to the league's commissioner raising concerns about player protection and demanding what they described as greater accountability. The letter named Clark specifically, pointing to a season that had already included the throat incident along with other physical contact that lawmakers characterized as repeated and unrest, describing a player who had been hip-checked, poked in the eye, and struck in the throat over the course of a single season. When a pattern of physical contact against one player becomes specific enough for members of Congress to catalog it in writing. Debate over Caitlin Clark's treatment in the WNBA now reaching beyond the court. Republican lawmakers in Congress sending a letter demanding accountability. How much longer can the organization employing that player treat its own response as optional? The Fever's response did not arrive proactively. It came only after the letter had already become public and the story had already spread across national outlets. When the organization finally spoke, its statement drew a clear boundary, saying that neither the team nor Clark had any interaction with the lawmakers involved and that they had been unaware of the letter before it surfaced. The statement went on to reiterate a general commitment to player safety, language that echoed comments the organization had repeated throughout the season without ever quite escalating into decisive action. How does an organization manage a story that involves its own franchise player reaching the halls of Congress without appearing to have anticipated it at all? The Fever's answer in practice was to wait. Wait for the letter to surface. Wait for the questions to arrive. Wait for reporters to ask before offering any position beyond the boilerplate language it had leaned on for weeks. The pattern from May had repeated itself in a much larger arena with much higher stakes, and the organization's instinct remained the same. React only once reaction became unavoidable. The Fever were not the only organization navigating a delicate balance that summer. The league's own commissioner had publicly condemned the hate directed at the opposing player involved in the throat incident, even as commentary elsewhere argued that the entire episode had been reduced to a single freeze frame rather than judged in the full context of the play. Caught between defending its own franchise player and a league office trying to manage backlash aimed in more than one direction, the Fever's front office had every reason to choose its words with precision. Choosing words with precision, though, is not the same as choosing to speak before being asked to. The organization had a clear opportunity to define its own position early ahead of the letter, ahead of the outside noise, and it let that opportunity pass. None of this suggested indifference toward Clark's safety as a stated value. An Indiana congressman says he wants the WNBA to explain how it plans to protect players on the court like Caitlin Clark. The language in every statement made clear the organization considered player protection a priority. What it did not make clear was any sense of urgency behind that language. Any evidence that the front office was working ahead of the story rather than catching up to it. And that gap between what an organization says it values and how quickly it acts on that value is exactly the kind of gap that tends to surface again. The silence around a superstar. That gap surfaced again almost immediately as criticism mounted over roster decisions, coaching rotations, and the broader question of whether the organization was doing enough to protect its franchise player from physical contact around the league. The Fever's general manager found himself on the defensive, describing the growing criticism as a ridiculous narrative rather than addressing the substance behind it directly. The comments came not long after Indiana secured a road win without Clark in the lineup. A result that should have quieted questions about the roster, yet instead sharpened them, since the win only underlined how differently the team performed with and without her on the floor. The win itself only added fuel to the debate it was supposed to settle. Fans and analysts had spent the preceding weeks questioning coaching rotations, roster construction, and what many viewed as a pattern of insufficient effort to shield Clark from physical play around the league. A close road victory without her in uniform did not answer any of those questions directly, but it did reopen them, since it demonstrated exactly how much the team's identity still depended on the players built up around her rather than any structural fix to the concerns being raised. Dismissing a narrative is not the same as answering the questions that built it, is it? The same defensive posture showed up on the court, too. When Clark picked up her sixth technical foul of the season on Monday, her Indiana Fever played the Phoenix Mercury in a game with 6 technical fouls, including one for Clark and an ejection. An infraction that put her 2 fouls away from an automatic 1-game suspension. She placed the blame on the officiating rather than her own reaction, telling reporters she had simply yelled at the official to make the call. Coach White addressed it afterward by saying conversations would happen internally about staying out of trouble. A response that once again kept the resolution behind closed doors rather than in front of the fans and cameras who had already seen the moment play out. If the organization keeps handling accountability privately, how is anyone outside the locker room supposed to know whether anything actually changes? Taken individually, none of these moments looks like a scandal, a misreporting deadline, a statement that came a beat too late, a general manager pushing back on fan frustration instead of engaging with it directly, a coach handling a disciplinary conversation privately rather than publicly. But strung together across a single season, they formed something closer to a pattern than a coincidence. An organization that consistently waits for a story to reach its loudest possible volume before it decides to speak rather than getting ahead of the moments that create the noise in the first place. That is the tension sitting underneath the record itself. On the same night, Clark became the first player in league history to record 40 points and 10 assists in a single game. Is last night. Caitlin Clark put together some history. She had the WNBA's first ever 45-point 10-assist game. The Fever did post a brief message online celebrating the performance in a handful of words. It was a real reaction, not silence. But a short caption after a historic night is not the same as an organization that has spent a season showing up ahead of its own headlines. What does it say about an institution when its best player keeps making history faster than the organization built to support her can find its own voice to match it? Consider the full sequence laid end to end. A missed injury deadline in May. A slow walk statement once a letter reached Congress in the summer. A general manager on the defensive rather than on the offensive. A coaching decision handled privately rather than explained publicly. And then in the middle of all of it, a night in July when the player at the center of every one of those stories did something no one in the sport's history had ever done. If an organization can find the words to dismiss a narrative it dislikes, Why does it take so much longer to find the words to get ahead of when it should have anticipated? The record now belongs to Caitlin Clark alone, filed permanently into a league history that did not have a category for it until she created one. The pattern sitting next to it belongs to the organization that employs her. And unlike a box score, it does not update in real time. It updates only when someone forces it to. Caitlin Clark rewrote the record book on a night no one will forget. Carrying a back injury, a minutes restriction, and a season of scrutiny that had nothing to do with basketball. That part of the story is settled. What still isn't settled is whether the Indiana Fever front office will start speaking before the moment forces its hand instead of after. A missed deadline, a delayed statement, a general manager on the defensive. History keeps arriving faster than the answers do. So tell us in the comments, does this organization owe its superstar more than a brief reaction? Like this video, share it, and subscribe to Hoops Uncovered for what comes next.